And now on the line is Michelle Murphy from Social Justice Ireland. Michelle, welcome to the programme.
Thank you, Darren.
Michelle, I know you do be on Donny's programme on Near FM occasionally, but this interview today is for a different programme on Near FM. We're going to talk mainly about what you are calling for in the next budget, but before we talk about that, could you give me a bit of a summary, please, as to your view on how harsh the impact of COVID-19 has had in Ireland to date when it comes to social justice and trying to create a more equal environment?
I think it certainly has a significant impact, particularly on those who were, I suppose, struggling and more vulnerable pre-COVID anyway. So, for example, people with disabilities, people on low pay, people on social welfare, older people who were isolated, and children, particularly disadvantaged children, really bore the brunt of the impact. I think the one thing it has shown us, though, is that, if governments and policymakers, if we all put our mind to it, we can actually do things very quickly in this country. We saw that the PUP was put in place over the space of a weekend, for example. And, extra money was found almost immediately for the health service. So it's shown us that we can change, and we can change quickly. I think now it's up to us all, and especially government, to take the opportunity. I mean, there's a lot of talk now about the recovery post-COVID as we come out of the public health restrictions and, the economic recovery plan. But that recovery has to be fair. And it really has to deliver for everyone, but it has to deliver most for those who were struggling pre-pandemic, because they already had very challenging situations, either in terms of health, income, living conditions. People with access to poor levels of accommodation are struggling to find a home or somewhere to rent. So I think the challenge is going to be to make sure that the recovery is fair and it's just, and it delivers a better standard of living for everyone. And so that's why, I suppose, looking to the budget, we are really focused on investment and the investments that you need to ensure that you have a fair recovery, and not only to address the things that, COVID shone a light on, such as low pay and the need to sort of ensure that our health service, particularly the community care element and the community health networks, are rolled out properly, but also all the things that were there pre-COVID, housing being the big issue, but also things like childcare, broadband reliability, adequacy of social welfare rates, for example. They are all still challenges that have to be met.
Okay, we talked about the budget in a minute again. I know that you in Social Justice Ireland are big supporters of Ireland meeting our targets on overseas development aid every year in line with the United Nations. I don't know if you know as much about this, because a lot of people don't, but the impact COVID has had across the world, and particularly in developing countries, it's huge as well, isn't it?
It's had a devastating impact. And, their health, I mean, as much as, we're all aware of the problems with our health system, we're in a privileged position to have a public health system that, could cope. So many of those countries don't have the public health systems. They don't have even the PPE, the oxygen supplies, access to any of those things needed to treat COVID patients. Neither also do they have the access to vaccines. And I think this is this has been raised by Oxfam and various others, and this is going to be hugely challenging now. I mean, there's no point in us rolling out vaccination programs across Europe and sharing extra, excess stock with each other, when you still have a significant proportion of the globe that haven't even received a single dose of a vaccine. So I think the issue around sort of waiving the patents really has to be discussed, and making sure that it's a global effort that went in to find the vaccines for COVID, and it should be a global effort to deliver them. And there's a very strong case to be made for waiving the vaccine patents when it comes to such a global public health emergency like this, because if you don't support those developing countries, in terms of rolling out the vaccine and managing COVID, then at the end of the day, we'll be living with it permanently, and there will always be some type of restrictions where it's whether it's, for example, foreign travel or whatever. because it will still be circulating and there'll be different mutations of it coming from those countries who aren't able to vaccinate their population because they don't have access to the vaccines. And we also have to look at then, should we be giving additional overseas development assistance, for example, to support countries in terms of their response to COVID? And that's certainly something, that our government should be looking at, especially now that we have a seat on the UN Security Council. We have an influential voice now, and we should be using our voice to make sure that the needs for those in developing countries are heard and that their voice is heard.
I interviewed Jim Clarkin from Oxfam last week on Air FM in his capacity as a spokesperson for the People's Vaccine Alliance Ireland, I'll be interviewing Caoimhe de Barra from Troker next week, also in her capacity. We just talked a bit more about the budget. You mentioned a few things in the budget. I read an article recently that said that EU leaders have agreed that in 2023 there will be cutbacks across the EU to try to bring EU government's budget deficit back in line with EU targets. But I read that the austerity is not going to be as harsh as during the Great Recession. Do you know any more about this, Michelle?
Well, I suppose we're hearing it from our own government, discussions around, a lot of the I suppose the narrative around the budget now is how big the deficit is, the need to bring it under control, to reduce it. I would be very concerned. Europe relaxed the fiscal rules, and that was a good thing. And I think, reinstating them too quickly will just stall any European recovery. And bringing in austerity measures to deal with the response to COVID, doesn't make any sense, because what it has shown is the need for investment in health services across the world, but also it's shown us that it's not just in Ireland, that there's problems with low pay, there's problems with access to services, and then on top of that you look at meeting our climate targets. That's all going to cost money, and I think talking about bringing back in fiscal rules and austerity policies now is not the time, and we know that there's been a global response to this, and the European Central Bank is not going to turn off the liquidity or turn off the tap and enforce countries to pay back the money it's loaned out, because that would not be in its interest, because you'd simply cause a cycle of economic depression. It's in the interest of the European Central Bank to make sure there's liquidity in the euro area, in the European Union member states. So. Our finance minister is president of the Euro group. We should be using this time to our advantage. So that's why I think it's really disappointing to hear all this talk about, that the size of our debt. We can service that debt, and over time the size of that debt relative to the size of our GDP will reduce. So as long as we can service a debt, and we can, we're in a very good position to do it. I don't see why we should be reducing the deficit. What we need to be doing is looking to see how we can get the money that we need to invest in housing, but also in green infrastructure, because we don't have, the infrastructure that is going to be required if we are going to meet the 2030 climate bill targets that we've set ourselves. They're going to be very, very challenging. And I don't think you're going to be able to instigate cuts at the same time as that. So, our focus on the budget really, and also at a European level, is to say, look, in terms of the COVID-related debt, that needs to be dealt with at a European level for every single member state, because that was unprecedented. It certainly wasn't expected. It's through no fault of anyone's that happened, and the ECB supplied the liquidity. When it comes to other issues, and Europe has the ambitious the European Green Deal, and it's got an relatively ambitious program now in terms of trying to address youth unemployment and those challenges. Well, cuts aren't the answer to that. Actually, investing in our services, our infrastructure, our education system, that's the answer. So for us, the focus on Budget 2022 is really on investment to deliver a fair recovery, because there's no point if, and I'm quoting the Taoiseach here, our economy takes off like a rocket but leaves a significant proportion of the population behind, like what happened previously. Because if you look at 2019, just before the pandemic hit, that was a year of almost full employment, record levels of economic growth, wage rises, but at the same time there was an extra 143,000 people experiencing deprivation. So that says a lot about the sort of two-tier economy we have, and that an awful lot of people, even people in we need to, build a future that's better, that's fair, and that a recovery that everybody benefits from.
Okay, Michelle, can you just tell me a bit more about you've mentioned a few things there in the interview. Can you tell me a bit more about the main things you're calling for from the Minister for Finance in the budget?
Finance. Well, I suppose one of the main things we're calling for is a €10 increase in social welfare rates so that would benchmark social welfare rates over 2 years. So 10 years in this budget, 10 years in the next budget, to 27.5% of average earnings. Because, people on social welfare, they haven't seen an increase in 2 years. They're on a fixed income CPI. So inflation, the cost of utilities and everything is going up. That means that if, anyone on fixed income, so pension, disability payments, unemployment benefits, the value of the money you have falls. So in order to pay increased costs elsewhere, you need to cut back in other places. So we're looking for a 10-year increase in social welfare in terms of, so looking at the environmental issue. We're looking at a commercial air transport tax of €204 million because, every car driver, anyone who takes a bus, a Lewis, you're subject to the carbon tax, but the fuel for airplanes, so the jet kerosene, isn't actually subject to any tax. So that's coming at a European level, but in such time, every sector has to make a contribution. So we're promoting a commercial air tax levy, which in normal times would raise €204 million. And look, in terms of housing, we're looking at dealing with more properties and mortgage difficulty, those with arrears of more than 10 years, that the state would take an equity stake in those mortgages. So that would be €1.4 billion. In terms of actually increasing investment in social housing, so setting a target of a particular set of units to be built each year for the next 10 years, that's €3.3 billion. Then in terms of looking at things like children and implementing the commitments we have towards paternity and parental leave, looking at increased funding for TUSLA in particular, now that there's such a backlog in terms of dealing with child protection issues, reducing our pupil-teacher ratios. For example, the one thing that COVID has highlighted is how large our class sizes are and the challenges then in terms of social distancing and the various public health measures. And then in terms of older people, looking at home care packages and investing in social care and home care packages that would cost about €106 million, looking at additional funding for nursing homes, increases for safeguarding measures, and then restoring the cost of disability services in full, for example, and increasing the domiciliary care allowance. So we've a suite of packages really. They've been presented we've sent them to all government TDs, all of the ministers, the relevant Oireachtas committee, and we've actually met with some ministers about our proposals. So I would hope that we have some sort of influence or our proposals are heard in advance of the budget.
Okay. The last interview I did with you, Michelle, was in February of last year, just before the first lockdown happened in Ireland, and we discussed your Sustainable Progress Index 2020 in terms of the UN global goals. Before we finish up, Michelle, I don't want to keep you much longer. Could you give me a bit of a summary of your Sustainable Progress Index 2021 in light of what we have just talked about with COVID?
So, we're working on that at the moment, and I suppose the one thing that, what will be published in February 2022, what it is going to show is that every country, and it's not just developing countries, need to actually meet the SDGs, because if you look at the 17 global goals, they impact on every area of life, but particularly in terms of where we were most impacted in COVID, so health services, the COVID-induced school closures, work, sustainable communities, zero poverty being one of the main goals as well, and the challenges around income. I think what we will see is we'll probably see actually some improvement in terms of the climate goals, just by virtue of the fact that everything was shut down a period of time, so emissions will have reduced. But I think we will have fallen in other areas, and so will other countries too. But I think the one thing that this has highlighted, and it was highlighted by actually Ursula von der Leyen when the Commission launched, I suppose, the legislation to go with their Green Deal, is the fact that the SDGs, the global goals, really should be at the heart of whether it's European policy making or national policy making. And we're hoping now, Minister McGrath mentioned at the last budget day a wellbeing budget, and looking at a wellbeing framework to look at the budget. And the National Economic and Social Council have been working on that, and we would be hopeful that in advance of the budget in October there will be a wellbeing framework sort of based around the global goals that really measures our progress in terms of budgetary terms. So it's not just economic growth, for example, but you look at the levels of poverty, the fact that it's so difficult for people to find a house or a home, whether you've access to public transport, whether the fact that, our target for hospital waiting list is 18 months, and that's supposed to be ambitious when, it clearly isn't. So, I mean, we're really hopeful that what the one thing the index has done, it's kind of shown to, or rather highlighted to politicians the need to look at a broader sort of wellbeing framework, and that you can do it within the SDGs and apply that to the budget and apply that to how we make decisions in this country. So we'd be hoping in October that Minister McGrath might launch the wellbeing framework that he's going to look that we will use then to, I suppose, analyse our budgets and our policies, and really, I suppose, embed the global goals, into our everyday lives, because they affect every single one of us. They're incredibly important, and the challenge has been previously it's seen as only targets for developing countries, but they're actually targets for all of us. And Ireland, we perform reasonably well on some, but we don't perform well at all on a lot of others, and we've plenty of ground to make up.